Hi everyone, Dr. Randhawa here from Altis, and what I want to discuss today is the hip complex and a few different ways to be looking at issues that arise with either pain or dysfunction. Specifically, I want to talk about internal rotation, but before I jump into the conversation regarding movement that occurs at the hip, I want to give us a little bit of context, and I want to do that through Dr. Charlie Weingroff's model of the core pendulum theory, which I think is an eloquent way of putting what happens at a joint. Now, if you imagine a pendulum that's sitting straight, dead center in the middle, it has the ability to swing to one end or to the other end. And we can view that ability to swing one way or the other way as what a joint has as far as full range of motion. So on one side of the board, we will have internal rotation, and on the other side, we have external rotation. Now, if I was to move that pendulum so it's no longer sitting dead center in the middle and is skewed one way or the other, it will still have the same arc of motion. But what we'll notice is that you're starting to lose a certain amount of internal or external rotation depending on where I'm moving that ball. That could be akin to saying your joint is no longer in the path of instantaneous rotation or it's lacking centration. Maybe a better way even of explaining this is the idea of degrees of freedom. Pendulum has so many degrees of freedom, but if we start to remove degrees of freedom through dysfunction or through pain or whatever it may have you'll start to lose the ability to express a full range of motion of that joint. Now, when it comes to the hip complex, I think that internal rotation is extremely crucial, especially in sports that involve the high knee position or the ability to have full hip flexion. Now, this could include kicking sports, it can include martial arts, and of course, track and field. So when we look at the ability of this joint to get to two different areas, and when we start to lose degrees of freedom, I think there's two concepts that we can use to help drive our rehabilitative or strength and conditioning approaches. And those are what I call position and transition. Now, position is really akin to control or being able to stabilize through various positions. And your ability to do that is dependent not only on the joint integrity itself, but obviously of neuromuscular control. Now, transition, in my mind, is akin to mobility. Are you able to transition through all of those ranges of motion without having the hindrance of something mechanical or physiological occurring within that joint? So to us, to understand that better and put it into a little bit of a different context, I urge everyone to review a really good paper that was published in 1999, I believe, by Hess et al. And that's the variation of rotation moment within the hip in hip flexion. Now, in this paper, they discuss the different moment arms that occur at the hip joint and how the interaction of different muscles contribute to those moment arms. And one interesting finding was that the fact that the glute medius, after you hit 90 degrees of hip flexion, actually starts to internally rotate the femur. Now, from a strength and conditioning perspective, this almost seems the opposite of what we've been doing. When we get into a deep squat position where we're breaking parallel, one of the common cues we have is to externally rotate to drive those external rotators of the hip, whereas when we think we're getting glute medius activation, we may not be. So again, it's an interesting paper that kind of reviews some of the different positions, and it may put a little bit more context into why internal rotation is something that we need to be looking for and the ability to get in, rather than thinking that external rotation is the main contributor of hip both function and the ability to get into specific positions. Now, there are a myriad of exercises that you could be using to get in hip internal rotation, and I just wanted to demonstrate two of them. One which will be focusing on the ability to control that posture and position, and the other that will look at transition. So to look at transition, what we'll do is get into hopefully a very familiar 90-90 position. And instead of doing our regular 90-90 where we're bringing our chest over our lead leg, we're actually going to be doing the opposite. We're going to be shoulder checking to the opposite hip and then trying to bring this shoulder down to our malleolus of the opposite leg. In doing so, we are now having a bit of internal rotation moment occur at this hip, so the trail leg, if you will. Holding in postures or positions for as long as you see necessary, but what we're trying to do here ultimately is hopefully get some transitional movement occurring within the hip itself. Now, if we start to look at position and being able to control that, this might involve a little bit more of an active process. So we'll have either a dowel or a stick or whatever you have available to you. we'll get back into this 90-90 position. I like to have our athletes have their hands on the dowel, pushing down just to get a little bit control through the upper extremity and through the trunk itself. And what we're going to attempt to do is to internally rotate through an active component, which means I'm going to try to lift this foot off the ground. And as I do that, I hold. Again, hold times will be specific to whatever your program or your philosophy calls for. But in doing this, we're looking at controlling a position from here to there and driving some of that hip internal rotation. Give those a whirl. Let me know what you guys think. And if you have any other questions about the hip, please let us know. Thanks for tuning in, guys.